I once handed keys to a tenant before rent cleared, lost $23,000 in 60 days because I had zero leverage once they had access. That was my wake-up call. Now, after 30-plus rental properties and hundreds of millions in real estate AUM managed through my firm, I can tell you without hesitation, the moment you give someone keys before payment clears, you've already lost the deal. Today on Brick and Dollar, I'm breaking down the first month rent default access trap, why it happens, what it costs you, and the exact system I built to never let it happen again. Let's start with what happened to that tenant I mentioned. It was a 3-bedroom single family in a secondary market where median home prices were running around $285,000 in Q3 2024. Good neighborhood, solid tenants in surrounding units, and this particular applicant had a 720 credit score, verified income at $4,800 monthly and 2 years of rental history. Everything looked clean on paper. I made one mistake. I handed over keys on move-in day before the ACH transfer had actually settled in my bank account. The lease was signed, the background check cleared, and I wanted to be the good guy landlord. I thought, what could possibly go wrong in 24 hours? Everything. That tenant filed for occupancy protection the moment they had keys. When the rent didn't arrive 48 hours later, turns out they'd lied about income, the bank had red flagged the application, and they were banking on me not checking again. I was already legally constrained. In my state, once a tenant has established occupancy, you need 30 days notice to begin eviction, then another 30-45 days minimum for the process itself. That's the legal reality in most jurisdictions. I spent $3,200 on legal fees, lost $4,100 in that first month's rent, spent another $800 on an eviction service, and the property sat vacant for 45 days while I processed the eviction. Total damage $8,100, but it gets worse. The tenant left the property damaged $2,400 in repairs. By the time I released the unit, I'd burned through $23,000 in lost rent, legal fees, repairs, and holding costs across those 90 days. That was 7 years ago. I haven't made that mistake since, and I want to make sure you never do either. Here's the math behind why early key handover destroys your deal. Let's say you own a property where median home prices in your market are $465,000, typical for a mid-tier metro area in 2024. Your monthly rent might be $200. From a cap rate perspective, you're targeting somewhere in the 5% to 8% range for residential, which means your annual return should be roughly $24,000 to $31,000. 1 month of lost rent isn't just 1/12th of that. It's leverage loss, legal costs, vacancy time, and reputational risk all stacked on top. But the real damage comes from what I call the access advantage flip. The moment keys are in a tenant's hand, they become the occupant. You become the person who has to prove they shouldn't be there. In traditional contract negotiations, possession is 90% of the law. Once someone's living in your property, the burden of proof shifts entirely to you. If they don't pay, if they claim maintenance issues, if they claim you violated their quiet enjoyment, suddenly your leverage is gone. They're not a future tenant signing an agreement. They're a current occupant with potential legal protections. I've worked with dozens of landlords who have been through evictions, and every single one of them tells the same story. I wish I'd never given them the keys. It's not even close, so let me walk you through the system I built after that loss that eliminates this risk entirely. Step 1 is payment verification, not lease signature. I don't care if the lease is signed, notarized, and witnessed by the governor. Keys don't move until payment clears. Not is pending. Not should arrive tomorrow. Actually clears into my account and has completed the settlement period. For ACH transfers, that's typically 1-2 business days after initiation. For certified checks or money orders, it's immediate. For wire transfers, it's the same day. I schedule key pickup or lockbox access exactly 24 hours after I can confirm the bank deposit has settled, not before. Step 2 is conditional occupancy language in the lease itself. Here's exactly what I include. Occupancy and key possession are contingent on receipt and clearance of first month rent, security deposit, and any required fees. Keys shall not be provided, and access to the property shall not commence until all payments have been cleared by property management company/owner and written confirmation has been provided to tenant. That language does 2 things. First, it sets expectations. Tenants know the rule upfront, so there's no "but the lease says" argument later. Second, it protects you legally. It establishes that possession hasn't transferred until you say it has, which means if someone claims they were a tenant living in the property, you have written proof they weren't, because the conditional language means they never had legal right to occupancy. Step 3 is the escrow buffer. For any tenant who doesn't have established banking history or whose background check has any flag at all late payments, even 30 days old on a credit report, I require that first month's rent be held in a neutral escrow account for 10 days after occupancy begins. Yes, it adds friction. Yes, some tenants complain, but I've avoided 4 defaults in the last 3 years this way. The moment a tenant's willing to do escrow, you've confirmed they actually have the funds, and if they don't want to do escrow, that's your signal to find someone else. A quality tenant who's genuinely employed and has money in the bank will not object to a 10-day escrow hold. Let me give you a real example from my portfolio. Last year, I reviewed an application for a 4-bedroom in a higher-end market where median home prices were sitting at $725,000 in Q4 2024, and monthly rent on that property is $3,400. The applicant had perfect credit, solid income verification, and I approved them. But because of my system, I required first month rent and security deposit, $6,800 total, to clear my business account before key pickup was scheduled. The tenant initiated the wire transfer on a Monday. It showed up Wednesday morning. I held the keys and confirmed receipt in writing to the tenant. Funds received and cleared. Key pickup scheduled for Friday after 2 p.m. at our office. Thursday night, I get a call from my property manager. The applicant is trying to pick up keys early, claiming they'd been told they could come by Thursday afternoon. My PM, trained on this system, said, "Keys are released Friday at 2 p.m. once we've confirmed everything is settled." That's our standard process for all tenants. The tenant got upset, but they showed up Friday and picked up the keys on schedule. 6 months later, the tenant is still there, paying on time. But here's what I learned later. That tenant had lied on their application about a previous eviction. If they'd gotten into the property on Thursday and then that information had surfaced Friday morning, which it did during a secondary background check, I would have been locked in a legal battle trying to remove someone who already had keys and claimed occupancy. Instead, because they didn't have keys until Friday, I had options. I could have legally cancelled the lease. That's the power of the system. Now let's talk about the regional variables, because where you operate matters a lot. If you're investing in markets where median home prices are $285,000 to $350,000, typical Midwest and Sun Belt secondary markets, your rental income might be $1,400 to $1,800 monthly. A default costs you 45-60 days minimum in most states before you can regain the property. That's $100 to $700 in direct lost rent, plus legal fees ranging from $800 to $2,000 plus vacancy costs and repairs. You're looking at $5,000 to $6,500 hit per default. That wipes out 3 to 5 months of profit on a property. If you're in a coastal market where median home prices are $850,000 to $2 million, California, Northeast Corridor, Seattle, Miami, your rent might be $4,200 to $5,800. A default costs you $6,300 to $8,700 in lost rent alone, plus legal fees can run $2,000 to $5,000 depending on court complexity and attorney rates. You're looking at $10,000 to $15,000 in damage per incident. That's 18-24 months of cap rate returns wiped out on a single default. For context, residential cap rates in these markets are typically running 2% to 1% in 2024 data, so you're really feeling that hit. Now, here's where the rent versus buy conversation comes in and why I always reference it. When you're evaluating whether to buy a rental property, one of the metrics I always include in my analysis is default risk cost versus buy and hold return. If you're a renter, you have zero default risk. You pay your rent, you use the space, you move on. The landlord absorbs all the risk. But when you're the landlord, you've just taken on that risk, and if you're not disciplined about it, it will compress your returns faster than a market downturn will. In my experience, landlords who don't have tight systems in place see default rates anywhere from 2% to 8% depending on market and tenant screening quality. That means one default every 12-50 months. A property-level return of 6% annually, $1.10,000 default wipes out 67 years of profit on a $600,000 property. It's not theoretical damage, it's real. So the system I've built is designed to compress that default risk to below 1%. And the cornerstone of that system is this: keys move only after payment clears. Let me also address the HOA angle, because it's relevant for certain markets. If you're buying in a development where HOA fees run $300 to $500 monthly, typical for middle-market suburban communities in 2024, those fees continue whether the property is occupied or vacant. A default that leads to 45 days of vacancy is costing you HOA fees, property taxes, insurance, and utilities on top of lost rent. It's not just the rent check you're missing. If you're in a luxury community where HOA fees run $1,000 to $800 per month, and I've got 2 properties in that tier, a 60-day vacancy is costing you $2,000 to $3,600 in fees alone before you even count rent or legal costs. That's why the system is so critical in HOA communities. One more pattern I've seen that matters: the 1031 exchange trap. If you're scaling a portfolio through 1031 exchanges, which follow IRS rules of 45-day identification and 180-day close timelines, a default on your current property can force you to miss your exchange window. I've seen investors have to liquidate an exchange because a tenant defaulted, they couldn't get the property back fast enough, and they missed the 180-day close deadline. That's $50,000 plus in tax liability and legal fees, all because someone was living in a property they didn't pay for. This is why the system isn't just about protecting this month's rent, it's about protecting the entire investment structure. Here's my final framework before we wrap. When you're about to hand keys over to a new tenant, run through this checklist. Payment cleared in my bank account, yes or no? Escrow completed if required,